today we have Laurie Voss from NPM.
Yeah.
One is a COO, and he has a wicked Twitter following as well, personal following with over 14,000 followers. You know, really something like that, something crazy. I even found you on Twitter. You were like, you know, you were being quoted. So I'm going to allow him to introduce himself. He is one of the players in the Silicon Valley, massive ecosystem across there. This is where tech happens. So Laurie, it's fantastic to have you. Thank you for taking time to be here with us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be talking to home again. I left Trinidad in 1999, the end of 1999. So I've been out of Trinidad for 17 years. So almost as long as I lived in Trinidad, I've now been out of Trinidad.
Yeah, you have lost the accent. You have to come back home.
People who know me growing up will tell you that I never had the accent. I don't know.
Not sure why.
Always sounded like this.
I hear
anyway. So for a little context about what NPM is and what I do, NPM is a company behind an open source project also called NPM. And NPM is the package manager for JavaScript.
Exactly. What does that really mean?
Right. What that means is people who write JavaScript code, they want to reuse code that other people are written. Rather than building every single application from scratch, most applications have a lot of components in common, so they want to be able to reuse pieces of other people's code.
That makes sense.
So NPM runs a thing called the registry, which is where people who write a piece of code that they think other people will want to use can upload that code. Other people can, search around, find a piece of code that looks interesting to them, and they use NPM to download that code and put it into their own application.
Got you. So you guys are recycling codes, saving loads of time, loads of money, basically being a resourceful company then.
Absolutely. It's most of the code is open source, so everybody's happy to do it. People are deliberately, sharing their code with each other.
So it's highly collaborative. Fantastic. That's exactly what we need. And that's a mindset in the Caribbean I find that we don't have. We want to work in silos. We want to keep things, my own or my firm's own, but there's such power in network, and your company's built on that.
I think it's one of the most interesting things about living in Silicon Valley. I worked in tech in London for 7 years. That was where I went to college.
Okay.
And working in tech in other places is very different from working in tech in Silicon Valley. And one of the things and it's largely a culture thing. And one of the big cultural things is that people are much less secretive about their ideas than you could possibly think. And they're also much less critical.
Do you think those both factors that you have just highlighted about the Valley is the reason why it is one of the hottest spots to be, where the biggest companies come out of?
I mean, Silicon Valley is extremely hard to replicate. People keep trying to do it, right? London has Silicon Alley, and India has something that they call, I can't remember what they call it, Silicon something else. Everybody calls it Silicon something. But, there's like 10 or 15 things that all happened at the same time only in Silicon Valley, and that's why it's so hard to replicate. There's 2 really great colleges in Stanford and Berkeley, right next to each other. There was a defense industry that at one point was pumping money into like silicon and literal silicon, chip design in the very early days. And that sort of created the manufacturing base and the sort of center of very rich people, basically, who all came out of those early companies. And they were like, okay, let's fund some more companies. And those companies created more money, and those companies created more money. Like, it's very hard to replicate Silicon Valley without creating a time machine.
A time machine.
there's lots of things about Silicon Valley that you can replicate, and one is this idea that execution is more important than the idea. Lots of people thought, I'll build a social network. Facebook is Facebook because Mark Zuckerberg is very good at doing that thing. He didn't have some very original idea, right? MySpace had been around before, Friendster had been around before. It's about what you build, not just having the idea.
You just mentioned that execution is the name of the game. I mean, I'm sure you didn't end up where you are by only thinking about code. You had to live it. You know, tell me your journey with this passion for coding. I'm assuming, do you have a passion for it?
Absolutely. I remember getting on the internet while I was still in Trinidad in 1996 and looking at web pages and going, wow, these are amazing. How does anybody do these? And at the time, the code was so simple, the tech was so simple that, in an afternoon, you could learn enough HTML, and there was only HTML to learn, that you could put together your own web page that was just as good as anything anybody else could build. That was the thing that I remember blowing me away. I remember looking at Trinidad.net, which was like the homepage of an ISP that I first used to log on,
right.
And looking at, say, the New York Times website. And they were equally good looking because there was so much you could do.
Yeah.
And I was like, Trinidad is on an even footing here. Nobody knows how to do this better than anybody else right now. It was right at the beginning. And that was really encouraging to me. And I think that should still be a point of encouragement for Caribbean entrepreneurs, is that the whole point of the internet is that it works from anywhere. Right?
Correct.
The famous quote is that on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. On the internet, nobody knows you're a Trinidadian. On the internet, you can just build an app. You don't have to build a thing that is specifically useful to people from the Caribbean. That is a mistake that I'm seeing people in the Caribbean, tech entrepreneurs in the Caribbean building a lot, is they're like, let me build something that's really good for the people in the Caribbean. I'm like, why would you do that? Only like 50 million people live in the Caribbean.
Precisely.
There's 4 billion people online. Why would you take it to that 50 million people? That's like, that's like New York City. It's like if you built an app that only worked for New York City. Why
people
would you
think you're crazy?
Right.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. We have to pass the who cares test internationally. And our mindset seems to inhibit us from doing that. We need to solve real problems, a human problem. We all human beings facing the same problem. But yet we allow geography to limit our business, or even limit us, when there's no reason to be limited by anything.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that being from the Caribbean has given me an advantage is that American companies and British companies and European companies, they tend to think of things from the perspective of rich countries. They tend to think of people who have very fast internet connections and all the latest hardware, and they just sort of, if they think of somebody who has a slow connection or cheap hardware at all, they go, oh, well, that person will upgrade. And I think one of the companies that has done a really great job of not doing that is Facebook. And it shows up like, the reason Facebook has 4 billion users is because Facebook literally sent teams of its engineers to live in India for months at a time and use Indian ISPs, use Indian hardware, like use that stuff and be like, what is the experience of Facebook like when you're there? And they were like, it is horrible. It is slow. This stuff is expensive. Nobody wants to do this stuff. People will log on for 5 minutes a day and try and download everything all at once and then read it later. And they were like, this app is not at all designed for that. And so they rebooted it. There's a version of Facebook that is designed for that market.
Okay, wow. So these guys just got immersed and got really, very targeted and personalized to geography then.
Right. So one of the things that people in the Caribbean can do is they can use the Caribbean's perspective of being a developing nation to build apps that appeal to developing nations across the world. Don't just build for the Caribbean, build for anybody who's in the same sort of economic position that countries like Trinidad are in.
That is brilliant advice. And I hope to God that whoever's listening to this today, if you take one thing, that is one and most important things that you could probably learn from Laurie today. As well as for NPM, who are your initial, your primary target market? Is it mostly coders?
It's almost entirely software developers.
Yeah.
It's a tool for software developers, so consumers will very seldom hear about this, and that is one thing that I wouldn't necessarily replicate.
Yes.
As a software developer, it's easy and it's fun to build a tool for other software developers, but a very small percentage of people are software developers.
Yeah, exactly. If you could actually let us know, how big is your company, NPM? How long has it been around? And how did you get into that? How did you actually become the CEO? Like, take us from the transition point from your previous position into NPM.
Sure. Well, let me give you the full history.
Lovely.
So I told you in 1996, I was looking at web pages going, how do I do that?
Yes.
And in 1996, you could teach yourself web development in an afternoon. It was a practical thing. There was only so much to learn, and I learned it. And then I literally went around, I started cold calling businesses in Trinidad in 1996 and be like,
wow.
You need a web page? And they were like, what is a web page? Some companies had already worked out that they need a website. And I could honestly say, like I said, I could build a web page as good as the New York Times tomorrow because it was only so good. So like 16-year-old me would stroll into their offices and be, let me build you this website. And they'd be like, you're right. That is as good as anything else anybody could build. So, I would get my mom to drive me to business meetings. I went to CIC, which lets you skip a year. So I had a year before I was old enough to get into university.
Okay.
So I took a gap year where I lived in London. And I used the experience of working for companies in Trinidad as sort of my portfolio. When I was interviewing, when I arrived in London, I was like, here are some websites I've already built. People have already paid me to build websites. And they were like, you're right. It's fine. You're as good as anybody else because it's 1999.
Yeah.
So I got professional experience being a web developer again before I even got to college.
Wow.
And I went to college for 3 years and it was really, really great. It taught me some stuff, but it really didn't teach me anything that I hadn't already learned while I was, in terms of professional skills, it didn't teach me anything I hadn't already learned by myself.
Right.
And when I left college, I went straight back to doing what I was doing before. I went to doing web development at startups.
Mm-hmm.
After a couple of years, I got a job at Yahoo, which has offices in the UK. And then as part of an internal reorganization, Yahoo in the UK offered me the chance to move to the US, which I took up.
Okay, great.
And that was really a step change in the trajectory of my career. I'd sort of been going along pretty slowly until that point. And being in Silicon Valley made an enormous amount of difference.